Hello everyone, back to the Bronze Age today, and more specifically we will discuss the Peleset medium infantry, or the Peleset military in general, because it's not that there is a huge deal to to tell relatively to the singular um, medium Peleset warrior. Actually, there would be, with all the proper sources and all. I tried to provide here just some um, let's say modern representation to entertain you in a certain sense. That my videos, graphically speaking, aren't this much, but I still think it's an interesting topic if you frame it into the general uh, um, environment, let's say, of the time. This is theoretically part of my say warrior um, type of videos, because I discuss essentially the equipment of a warrior from history and try to point out how he or she sometimes even fought into that time, and on the base of his equipment and all. So relatively to the Peleset, here I should first of all give a background of what I'm talking about, because telling the truth, I neither knew so much about the and still don't know very much about the Sea Peoples and the Peleset proper. So we are in the Bronze Age, roughly between the, let's say, in the second half of the second millennium BC. Between the here we will discussing chiefly the Peleset between the 13th and 12th centuries BC. So a lot of time ago, yes, but neither so much, because that the first of all, the Pelesets were one of the sea peoples. I don't have a better way to call them, in the sense that I think they're singular people. That there are several, I don't know, other 4 or 5 peoples whose name we know, besides the one of the Peleset. At this time, the Peleset were some of the most prominent and warlike of these populations, but we know really a very few about them. So the Sea Peoples were it was actually, I think, the name through which only the Egyptians called these populations, or at least it was a broad denomination, of course, I believe, even if we don't have other extensive knowledge of how they were called elsewhere, because they did come from the sea. And the ancient Egypt at this time was still a prominent force into the into northeastern Africa and the Near East. And these populations were essentially pirates, coming from the Egyptian perspective from the sea. The Egyptians had navies at this time, but they weren't as extremely strong maritime force, and the Mediterranean was populated by these these bands, essentially. The Sea Peoples were, in this sense, something much variegated in ethnical terms. The major problem about them is that we don't really know who they were from an ethnical point of view. Yet they were essentially the populations that contributed to the collapse of the I can't say of the Bronze Age civilization, but partly they contributed to the to the destruction of many civilizations, including the Achaean one, and brought eventually, especially in Greece, to the so-called Hellenic Middle Ages, that I'm sure has many other reasons. I mean, for which, but let's say that as other times in history, it happened that new waves of populations arrive and cause problems. And these waves are not really the main cause of the problems, but these populations are on the move because they already spot crisis on a local basis in faraway lands, and they take the opportunity as pirates to essentially spread. This is the same thing I was talking about incidentally before yesterday with the Saracens that arrived at the end of the Carolingian Empire, the collapse of the Byzantine one, the shrinking of the Byzantine one. So in many times in history, piracy is something that expands in moments of crisis of big political entities. Here in Bronze Age it's a bit different because while it is true that there were solid political entities in some parts of the Mediterranean, take Egypt, the rest of the Mediterranean saw a much higher degree of fragmentation, so piracy was extremely common at this time, in spite of the sea peoples, we can say. The sea peoples brought probably another character, but who were they ethnically we don't really know. We think they were actually Indo-European, because they were coming essentially from the Balkans and in the north. The sea peoples, first of all, the Pelesets, etymologically speaking, have been tied as a name to what the later Hellenic classical historiography named as the Pelasgians. The Pelasgians is also here a very vague terminology being used at the time to define basically all the populations that pre-existed to the Hellenic Indo-European migrations. So basically before that the polis were born, even though there is some continuity, at least urbanistically speaking, and part of these populations blended together with the Hellenes that were coming from the north, but that they were in this sense also maybe something more determinate, because in the for instance in Homer's work, the Pelasgians are part of the world of the Iliad. The Trojans were allied with the Pelasgians that were told to be inhabiting the lands of northeastern Greece. So this relatively tribal, I mean, even Mycenaean society was essentially tribal, but or monarchical, but with still a clanic, let's say, form of political aggregation, in spite of the major powers that were able eventually to develop and to structure themselves politically speaking. And given the geographical direction from which they were coming, we know that they eventually went south. The same Homeric works say that the Pelasgians at a certain point go to Crete and settle there. And in fact, the Pelesets today are believed, I think, by the majority of historians, to be coming from Crete. I've found other books saying that they were coming also from other places, like from Caria on the southern coast of Anatolia, just in front of Cyprus, and Cyprus as well. And as a matter of fact, we do connect, I repeat, there is no certainty about this whatsoever. And we think that there was a major movement of these Pelasgian peoples throughout Anatolia and eventually the Near East. I mean, today's lands of Syria and Palestine, that seemingly, the latter of which took seemingly name from the same Pelesets, and that were associated in this sense to the Philistines, because Palestine takes name from Philistines, and Philistines are the ones of the Bible against the ones the Jews fight. They're this quite markedly warlike people. The legend of Goliath, the episode, however you want to call it, about Goliath and David is supposedly gonna, it's a metaphor essentially that it is depicting the very intense clashes of the Jews with these new warlike settlers. The fact that Goliath is conceived as a giant here might even stress the idea that these Philistines were ethnically different. I mean, the idea that the Indo-Europeans were bigger guys, substantially taller than the average Near Eastern inhabitant is definitely something plausible. So in many times in history this idea of the giant comes back for similar reasons. Also the Romans depicted Germans as through the Gauls, by the way, were telling to them before meeting the Germans that were giants. So the idea that the warriors of the north were bigger, tougher, definitely arose legions on the on their size, on their and the Philistines were also, as we were saying, pretty warlike populations. So we have actually evidence of, besides talking about the Philistines, because the Philistines is the last stage, but what we know, the middle part, the connection between Pelesets and Philistines, come mostly from the Egyptian sources, because we have extensive evidence of Pelesets being raised as mercenaries from the Egyptians and being used even, it seems that, I don't remember now from which sources, but that the Pharaoh's bodyguard at Kadesh was seemingly made up of these Philistines. So as many other times in history, big rulers, important sovereigns, chose their bodyguard from foreign peoples, foreign populations. This is what the Romans did with the Germanic guard of Augustus. This is what the Byzantines did with the Varangians. Also in the Muslim world there were caliphs that had Christian guards. So this is pretty normal, because the Pelesets actually were fought by the Egyptians because there were pirates invading the North African coasts as well, and we have actually also depictions of Egyptians and hiring Pelesets, and there is an iconographical source that shows actually what are believed to be sea people's mercenaries in the Egyptian armies slaughtering the Libyans against the literally cutting them to pieces during the wars between the Egyptians and the Libyans. And therefore we know, as any time in history, that the enemies you fight against can also be won with money, and to essentially hire them in your ranks, especially if they look so warlike and and fierce and good in terms of military quality. These sea peoples and Pelesets were, however, coming both from sea and land, and therefore there is another thing that here brings to the Philistines, because the Pelesets are documented at one point to be settled by the Egyptians into, I don't remember whether Palestine or another even closer place to Egypt, I don't remember accurately now. I should give a look, but well, I don't remember, but let's say that there is evidence that there were Egyptian garrisons of of the Egyptian, let's say, empire at this point that were Pelesets. So this is pretty normal, as think about the Federati in the Roman times, or any other population that was settled by major powers to their borders to essentially guard them. And the Philistines, in this sense, coming from the north of the Near East, from supposedly, as we have seen, Anatolia and even the Balkans, were settled into what what is better known chiefly as the Philistine Pentapolis, and therefore creating this group that is so well known, especially from the Bible. But the Pelisets, in this sense, are quite easily, we don't have the full certainty about this either, but we can say that there is a continuity between them and the Pelisets. The Pelisets are witnessed also in the Fertile Crescent at a point, so they were really, they didn't come straight from Crete or wherever they were settled to go there. They were wandering around. There were bands of warriors, essentially. And I think mostly from linguistical evidence. I'm no expert at all, so I'm just referring what I found here and there from books. But there is some connection between the Philistine language and the Indo-European languages of this time. I think that the Indo-Europeans as such during this 13th, 12th century were essentially still, they had still to migrate en masse. They were probably still, these populations were beginning at this time, probably in smaller numbers than what eventually they did afterwards, especially with their migration into Central Europe. But it is important to trace back these migrations to this Caucasian cauldron from which supposedly this Aryan population stemmed, and at regular waves entered into contact with the with the populations of Southern Europe and Southern Asia and North Africa, as with the Egyptians in this case. Now, I remember what else I wanted to say. Well, there are many things that we can say actually about the sea peoples and their warfare. I'm not gonna do it now because I will do it in another video, but really the main characteristics can be summed up relatively easily, because these were chiefly pirates. They were good sailors. They clashed at sea even with the Egyptians and winning them. Also, the Egyptians won them in some occasions. But let's say that were quite dangerous populations. We have evidence of them stretching even to Sardinia. I mean, they sailed far and wide. And as pirates were very aggressive, really. So they're, as I was saying before, their main characteristics were definitely the one of tribal warriors that joined together in some form of league, evidently, because the sea peoples are told, for instance, from Egyptian sources, to have fought together in different to have joined together sometimes, like the Pelisets are witnessed fighting with the other sea peoples jointly. So this tells us that I personally believe that the single, I mean, if you take the Pelisets, these were really people, a people with some degree of ethnical homogeneity that in turn had tribes on its own. So they weren't, according to me, singular tribes, even though here, even relatively to definition, we could argue the whole thing. But let's say that there were various populations coming together for the sake of raiding. They had a mainly predatory mindset. Eventually, as it happens with nomads or semi-nomads, they end up to settle down, to become sedentary and to do else. Evidently, these populations are the ones that also gave birth to other modern peoples in the area, and the age of nomadism, if there is anything like this, eventually stops at a point. At least in the area. Obviously, there is an age of nomadism because, really, before 5,000 years ago, we were all hunter-gatherers, so we were or nomads in some form. But what I'm saying is that the Mediterranean was this area that already at the time was pretty advanced, pretty rich, that allowed people to live with a surplus deriving from agriculture, from trade. So it was normal for these populations to arrive with a very strong predatory mindset, with even until cultural limits in front of the of sedentarism, but eventually getting absorbed. This is like with the Philistines, as we have seen. Yes, relatively to the Pelisets and the Philistines, this is important. I wanted to say that the settlement into Palestine occurred seemingly under the headship of the Egyptian emperors, the pharaohs, and and this is actually supported by some evidence in the sense that evidently Egypt at this point had a huge political power and prestige, so it could control the populations that were settling at its borders. There is, I think, extensive evidence on the Bible, in the Bible, that the Philistines were, together with the Jews, client states of the Egyptians. The Jews. I'm talking the ones that already settled into Palestine at this time, because obviously there is all the escape from Egypt and all. But at this point, the Philistines and Jews were pretty close neighbors, and they were often fighting against each other. And there is evidence in the Bible even that during the wars against the Jews and Philistines, I don't remember now the passage, so I'm just paraphrasing, and I don't even remember who was who there. There was, I think, one of the Jews that was asking the son, no, while they were in a battle against, I mean, here I think it was a battle against the Jews and the Philistines going on, and one of the Jews says, "Let not the sun arrive now," which is pretty Sibylline in its meaning, and it's been interpreted as a metaphor in here of the fact that the sun was the pharaoh, also because of the solar symbolism surroundings the pharaoh, Ra, and all. Not let the pharaoh come while these two populations were fighting. Here it was a battle, but generally speaking, the thing means that basically the Egyptians, as we know, by the way, sent administrators, representatives of the pharaoh's rule within these populations, and definitely he could control even how they were dwelling, and maybe stopping, putting a stop to wars if these were seen as detrimental for the unity of that particular region, for the Egyptian interests. So let's say that even the Pelisets that were settled into that area of the Near East were definitely framed in part also under the Egyptian domination. This is just for saying how variegated, say, and multifaceted the relations with these populations were, and how close were we, especially with the Egyptians that have left us an extensive extensive for the time. Obviously it's not massive, but it is still very consistent, of the Philistine, or the Pelisets, better say, look, we can say, as warriors, because they're represented, I think, exclusively as warriors, and also because they were represented in the into these glorious deeds of the pharaoh that was fighting against these various peoples. Here I've got a list of the sources, of the primary sources for the Pelesets. There are, I think, all definitely all archaeological. Medinet Habu from the time of Ramesses III. These are I don't know how to say that, reliefs, or I don't know, when you sculpt in a rock and you have these pictures. The papyrus Harris, now this is a papyrus from Ramesses III. The rhetorical stele chapel C at Deir el Medina, Ramesses III, and the onomasticon of Amenemope from the late 22nd D. So people who know what I'm talking about can go look at that. I don't know either, so it's just an indication. So I think, by the way, Peleset is as many other names that we mentioned now, is a transliteration. I think that the original name from, I think the ancient Egyptian language should be something like Perversti, something like that. So you even sound it's closer to Philistine, to Palestine, and kind of makes sense. Now we call them Peleset. So passing to the Peleset warfare. Here I've got a picture, as you can see, of what it should be an average. Well, not really an average. Yes, let's say average, because here I looked at the sword and said, swords were expensive at this time, like in other times in history. He might have been something bigger than the usual. Something, I mean, a better equipped warrior than the Peleset average. But it is indeed true that from iconographical evidence, the wide majority, if not the totality, but I'm not sure about this, definitely not the totality, because I remember something else, of Peleset warriors, at least infantrymen, are equipped with swords. So one can argue about this, how the Pelesets were, relatively not segmented socially to have this well-off middle class that could, especially through raiding and looting, I imagine, equip itself with these fine Bronze Age swords. This so-called triangular elongated shape is typical of the Bronze Age at this time. This is a sword that was conceived to be mainly a thrusting weapon. It could cut, definitely slashing, but for reasons that I can't fully explain now, by the way, was conceived. I mean, these weren't excessively resistant materials. They were conceived chiefly to thrust, to reduce essentially the the force on coming from other sides of the structure that could damage it in some way. I know that probably archaeologists are really like tearing their hair off their head the way I'm explaining this, but essentially I believe this is the concept, and I'm by evidently no expert about Bronze Age weaponry, but I think that much has to do. These were essentially made of copper with some other with maybe some addition of other, or arsenic or something like that, and they're pretty usually they could be varying in length. Some could arrive to 90 centimeters as well, some to 30. So they were extremely long. Definitely, some seem more like daggers in practice. And there is evidence of of these swords scattered all over the Mediterranean. Also in here there is nothing relatively you know they're not an ethnic indicator. I mean, the material culture was pretty homogeneous at this time. Excuse me, I drink a little. They had gilded hills. They were definitely used also among other populations. Um, but the impression is that the sword was in this sense also quite versatile. Uh, Weapon could be used. It was relatively light. So you have to think about the concept of this warrior as it is. Here I've cut the legs of the poor guy, but I don't think we have evidence for these medium and lighter Peleset warriors to have worn greaves, even though there is evidence of much heavier armor among the sea peoples that I will discuss maybe another time. This is the medium Peleset infantry. So you notice this headgear that it looks like a tiara. Essentially, it was made of bronze, and you see here this bunch of red feathers that have seemingly been the tribal, how you want to call it, distinction of the Philistines. And here you have um, an example of what I'm talking about. This is the picture of a prisoner captured by the Egyptians, that is possibly a peasant, wearing this typical feathered reed or leather striped tiara, helmet, or headdress. In the main picture, it's not in leather, it's metal, but in here, essentially every time that the Pelesets are represented have this kind of headgear, head protection, and therefore we tend to distinguish the Pelesets from this. And these things had seemingly also a neck guard that you can see also in here. These are not supposedly the hair, but a net guard, so piece of armor prolonging under on his nape, essentially. Then passing to the armor. Here the guy is represented with something like a band of essentially of leather, I believe, of hardened leather or other material. Although there are variations in this, there is actually a more typical form of this of the Peleset armor that you can see from here. This is a scene depicting Egyptian warriors attacking the sea peoples during a sea battle, by the way. And the guy here that is being striken is seemingly a Peleset. You see the headgear also in here is pretty similar to the one that we already seen. And you can see this fabric corselet, essentially, that without shoulder protection, while we have evidence, like in the background picture I chose for this video, of straps like that, that had this kind of lobster form pattern over the corselet. Whose pointed angle could be either upwards or downwards. Here it's upwards. And it could be done actually of various kinds of material. It would seem probably leather, but it could be other thick material, even fabric of some kind, as we have seen. This gives the idea, and the that these guys were normally, for those time standards, wearing as average soldier uh, a light form of armor of protection. Here you can see even shoulder protections that I'm sure in certain iconographical sources are even more pronounced, covering actually the shoulder with a um, with a sort of plate armor, we can say, not in metal, always of these organic materials, but that had the objective of uh, really covering the whole shoulder, the whole muscle, and protecting also the bone underneath. A light, definitely a form of light equipment, but you have to think for Bronze Age standards, definitely useful, especially against cutting weapons that, as we've seen, they didn't have this huge cutting power compared to later to weapons of later times in history, but were still pretty harming and damaging. So the idea of this heavy infantry, of this medium infantry troops covered with sort of leather armor were conceived to go to be relatively well armored for Bronze Age standards, especially among these semi-nomadic populations that also needed mobility in this sense. The Pelisets were probably quite dynamic in their warfare as pirates. You can imagine all the amphibious operations, the agility required to move on a deck, on a ship's deck, or for assaulting and all. And by the way, these populations moved also across a quite quite mountainous areas of Anatolia, in the Anatolian hinterlands, that might have definitely obliged them to wear such lighter equipment. We have seen that we think they came chiefly from Crete at this time, but that some of them might have settled in the meanwhile also in Anatolia, and those regions of Decaria, etc., have always been famous for this light infantries that were capable of fighting on hilly or mountainous terrain, that were pretty agile and quite versed into hit and run tactics and guerrilla and all. So the dynamism is something you find quite clearly around this Bronze Age world, especially when it gets to populations that didn't have a solid stale structure like there could be in Egypt or in the Fertile Crescent. And so this is really the norm for medium infantry at the time. What is interesting is also the buckler, that in certain representations is um, 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 it's actually heavier than than something like it's depicted here in the which seems substantially a wooden or maybe hardened skin shield. That together with the bronze swords, especially of this elongated form, could be really really effective, because the idea of dagger and buckler fencing is out there, historically speaking, for lighter units. Especially the elongated form of the bronze swords, and also other material that are found at this time is kind of kind of makes sense, because if you have a 90 centimeter sword, that is the longest that you can see, you can keep the enemy at distance relatively easily, and together with your buckler at close, you know, essentially protecting your left and right hand together, making the blade sticking at the side of the shield and trying to hit the enemy with very rapid thrusts. This is a kind of way that this could occur, and at the same time, even if this was occurring at close range, still with a sword, being relatively at distance and being able to retract yourself and being lightly kept at the point of maintaining the agility to achieve so. This tells that these guys were also pretty good at this kind of tactics. They probably had, excuse me, of this kind of fencing. They were probably also quite, they had a quite high level of individual military quality and training as warriors, or as raiders, as pirates that spent all their lives fighting, essentially. And we know that, you know, we have the images of these sea peoples landing into the Mediterranean coasts of the Near East and spreading terror with fast attacks and all. So really, rapidity seems to have been one characteristics of these Pelisets combat skills, and usually this buckler had two handles. The and by the way, seemingly the Pelisets fought either barefoot or wearing short sandals. So this tells us, by the way, of different materials that we're not gonna name, but now, because it's also highly conjectural what we know about this. And the idea is about the picture of an extremely agile soldier. There was the way the sword was hanged was usually carried at a belt, passing over the left shoulder. I think there is evidence also of scabbards, and so as it would be normal, by the way. This medium Peleset infantry gives the idea of an extremely agile soldier. By the way, the javelins, we have evidence, especially I think on an iconographic piece that shows the Pelesets fighting from a war chariot, of Pelesets being equipped with javelins. So I think there is evidence also of other sea peoples using two javelins and stuff like that. So this tells us that they were also, as it was the norm for tribal peoples at the time, to have this preparatory skirmishing phase during combat, after which eventually they passed with a sword on the enemy. This is a natural tactics you find everywhere in the ancient world, and there is nothing really to explain conceptually. The idea is softening up the enemy ranks before assaulting them. The javelins could definitely be used also as lances on their own. This kind seems particularly fit for throwing use rather than as a stopping weapon, stopping spear. But there were definitely many variations of this. The sets are depicted also on the. Here you can see the baldric, by the way, attached with the belt across the the torso. The around the torso, so not across. Um, Another evidence is the use of bows from the Pelisets, even though this is usually told the other way around. Practically, from the representation of the Pelisets on the chariot, there is evidence of quivers mounted on the chariots, but not of the Pelisets using the bow from the chariot, the war chariot. So people have said since there is no other evidence of sea peoples using bow, I believe. Surely for the Palisades, I think for the other sea peoples, I'm not really aware. But people said there is a distinct absence of bow use among these peoples. Why? I mean, like bows were widespread everywhere. Why shouldn't the Palisades? Why wouldn't the Palisades use them? Just because we don't have the evidence of that, it doesn't make sense logically speaking that a universal weapon like the bow is, in all times in history, even in prehistory, shouldn't be used by these populations. I don't think so. I think they definitely used it. Maybe they weren't so keen on it, and maybe I don't know. Maybe the absence of evidence is part of some structural reason that perhaps can conceive the fact that these guys maybe didn't like bows, or they deemed that to be, I don't know, for certain cultural reasons, they were not a loyal weapon. But come on, at the time bows were in use pretty extensively. One might think that, I don't know, the Indo-Europeans already had this idea of the honor of the single warrior that hadn't to be killed by bows and all, but we know that bows were there all the time, even among the Indo-Europeans, so what the hell? I think they were used. Also because, by the way, in the Near East, there was a pretty extensive use of bowmen. So it kind of makes sense that these populations eventually came to use the throwing weapons just like the others. Maybe the episode of Goliath and David is showing that this Philistine warrior that went there for a duel really regarded the one versus one clash in hand-to-hand combat to be a rightful way of fighting. Instead, the young David uses a sling and hits the guy and the giant and kills him. So that might be a trace from the Bible, a hint from the Bible that the Jews were even refusing the Philistine rules in forms of of contempt towards the Philistines themselves. But this seems just a speculation. I mean, it's still a powerful image, because really definitely a guy who wants to, the image of Goliath and David is very meaningful in our Western world. It's very famous for a reason, and it definitely made a lot of sense symbolically when the Bible was written down. To really stress something that goes beyond the pure anecdote, and that might conceal this maybe in unwillingness of the Philistines to fight with throwing weapons at a distance, and maybe considering that a cowardly way of fighting. the Jews made up the sling in this sense as sort of their one of their favorite weapons, also because they were pretty good at guerrilla, and they often fought against armies that were more armored than them on average. Think about the I don't know, the Seleucids or the Romans and the Jewish revolts that made definitely extensive use of skirmishers, of missile throwers and all. But this is really ultra speculation about what is to trace a sort of Peleset to support the evidence of a Peleset refusal for absence of you know of bows in their weaponry. So in my opinion, doesn't make much sense. And it could be that maybe these guys relied more than other populations on a greater emphasis on charging, on hand-to-hand combat, on this power of infantries. Because, by the way, the sea peoples were definitely the ones who brought an end even to the war chariot era, because of the compactness of their formations. So the idea that a single body of soldiers that had to resist to arrows and to assault en masse against the enemy that was usually lighter is there. So it kind of makes sense that maybe bows weren't used so extensively into the Peleset's warfare than in other peoples like the Egyptians, like the Mesopotamians. However, this is no evidence that there was no use of bows among the Pelesets. I don't know what else to add. I don't know how this video turned out to be. Probably I've said a bunch of mistakes. First of all, just right now I don't really remember whether I was right in saying that the Pelesets came in parts also from Cyprus and that they were seen there. I mean, it is possible, but I don't remember. It's plausible even historically, but I wouldn't like to have given you a wrong indication. Relatively to the swords, before I said that some were just in copper. Yes, some weaponry at this time was just in copper, some was in bronze. We are in the Bronze Age, so don't absolutize. I said at a certain point that those triangular elongated shaped swords finds were mostly in copper. Yes, some were also in bronze, of course. So this is fine, and this is it. Sorry I can't say more, because really the evidence that we have about this is pretty scanty. Aside from the use of war chariots and we haven't talked about the Peleset ships, but that will probably fit in another video, because this was chiefly about the infantrymen. That could be also sailors, so that had definitely the but this is that refers to military, to naval technology. Now we're talking just about the individual guys as individual fighters. Okay, so it's better if I don't add more at this point, and I just hope that you liked this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in receiving news about my next contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye!